Okay, should we press on and people can join via that telephone number and conference ID if they've got audio issues. For those of you that can't hear me, thanks very much for turning up. Um, this is going to be quite a fleeting overview of a review of the Lync roles and components that are involved in a typical Lync deployment, so that you have a kind of greater understanding of what's involved when you're sat down having a discussion with somebody. It's almost like a jargon busting exercise, so that when you engage in a planning and deployment exercise for Lync, you should, on completion of this, understand the roles and the components, the requirements, and what features rely on what servers, so that you can relate and have more input into any planning exercise that might take place. I appreciate that some people have already had exposure to Lync, and for others, this is probably a prereq to taking Lync on board or going through some kind of planning exercise. So I've tried to pitch it kind of in the middle. So I do apologise for those people that have had a lot of exposure. I don't want to teach people to suck eggs, but in the same vein, I'm trying to cater for those that are dipping their toes in the water, as it were, for the first time. If you've got any questions, then feel free to put them in IM, and I'll kind of try to take tactical breaks as we go through and answer them, particularly if they're relative to the point that I'm talking about at that time, if that's okay. Okay, so my name is Ben Donaldson. I work at Nexus Open Systems. I've been here for 2 years now as a technical consultant. 95% of my time is spent working on Microsoft Lync. I'm in the fortunate position of being able to do fruition or conception through to fruition with Lync. So everything from the architecture and design and pre-engagement stage right the way through to support, end user training and maintenance, etc. Which is quite nice because most people in the Lync world, they'll either be a dedicated architect or they'll be third line support or a particular niche area. So I enjoy working at Nexus at the moment purely because of that. I am a bit of an evangelist when it comes to Lync. I contribute regularly to the Microsoft community. I blog regularly. So I do like it in terms of working on Lync outside of work as well. But I do real man stuff and go and drink beer as well. I'm not a complete nerd, as it were. Okay, if you've got any questions at any point off the back of this as well, perhaps something that's a bit more deeper, then by all means contact Nexus or myself. And if you feel that this isn't directly hitting what you thought you'd get from it, then by all means we can tailor something that's a bit more bespoke and have a discussion at a later time. Okay, so what I'm going to go through in the next sort of hour or so is these points on the board. Okay, I won't whittle them off, but you can see that most of these are the key components of a Lync environment. Talking about the infrastructure, the servers that are involved, and then the whole middle set of points talk about the key features and concepts in Lync, and then towards the end we'll look at the wider picture and the Lync ecosystem and how third-party vendors are becoming involved with Lync now as well. So I'm hoping everyone kind of already has an idea of what Lync is, but just to kind of sum it up in a nutshell, it's Microsoft's iteration of a unified communications platform. So it's not a replacement phone system. It can be a replacement phone system, but it's much more than that. Typically in the world today, we're so well connected that it's very easy for a company of any size, whether it's 50 people or 50,000 people, to all of a sudden have a really disjointed communication experience where you've perhaps got instant messaging, email, telephony, voicemail, dedicated conferencing solutions, none of which really integrate with each other. So you might have a Polycom conferencing solution, you might have an Astra phone system with voicemail, you might use the Office stack, most people do, the Office suite, for email with Exchange and word processing, etc. But none of those things are tied together. And quite often, if there's authentication involved, there'll be different usernames and passwords. There's no common GUI or anything. People who book conference rooms will go there and not understand how to use the equipment. So the idea of a unified communications platform is to bring all that together in a common interface. And there are many good ones on the market, such as Cisco, but Lync is Microsoft's iteration of it. And as of this year, Gartner are really rating Lync, the Gartner Magic Quadrant, as the product at the moment. So they're visionaries and leaders in their field at the moment, and they're selling more enterprise voice seats than any other unified communications platform, okay? And this is Microsoft Flavor. You might have already heard about Skype for Business, which is due in the second half of 2015. Lync will be undergoing a rebranding exercise and become Skype for Business in 2015. It doesn't mean a change to the feature set or the product set as a whole. It is pretty much a rebranding exercise for the time being with a few minor cosmetic changes. Microsoft acquired Skype way back in 2012 for $8 billion. And at that point, those people kind of in the loop and the heavy hitters and those most involved with Lync at the time could kind of see into the future and had already decided that this was on the cards. But until 2 weeks ago, it was still an unknown, and it was officially announced, I think, mid-November. But other than the announcement, there hasn't been any kind of other details released at this time. But it's scheduled for the later half of 2015. And by all means, if you want to be on some kind of mailing list, being a Microsoft partner, obviously we get all the newsletters through from Microsoft regarding Lync, etc. If you'd like to be kept abreast in those types of things, and you don't have access to those types of resources yourself, we can do that for you. So by all means, let us know and we can keep you in the loop. Going off on a tangent there slightly. So back to planning and deployment. When you're planning and deploying Lync, obviously you need to have a good understanding of the roles, components, and servers that are involved, okay? You can adopt Lync in a number of different ways, what we call flavors, and they're displayed on the board there. There are 4 distinct ways in which you can adopt Lync. Most commonly is on-premises, and this is to date still the most common for large-scale or medium to large-scale Lync deployments, okay? On-premises is what it says on the tin. Your servers will be on your own soil, on your site, in your own company data centers, or at your place of work. And they will leverage your own infrastructure, okay? There are no limitations with on-premises deployments. You are able to leverage every single Lync feature that's available, and you can integrate qualified third-party applications with Lync as well. So things like call centers, attendant consoles, wallboard monitors, reporting services, etc. They can all be integrated to an on-premises Lync deployment. So it offers you a wider set of features than any other flavor that we're going to come on to in a moment would. It comes in 2 distinct SKUs, if you like, standard and enterprise, and we'll talk about those on a later slide. They're identical. You can't do any more in enterprise that you can't do in standard. So they're, in terms of features, they're the same. Your choice between standard and enterprise comes down to high availability, and we'll talk about that on a different slide. But obviously, if you're deploying a Lync environment on your own infrastructure, then you need to ensure that you adhere to best practices regarding server requirements or minimum requirements, as it says on the slide there. And there is something called a Lync planning kit available from Microsoft, capacity planning kit, which if you download, it will go through a wizard-driven based GUI, if you like, that will help you, assist you in terms of defining what resources you need, so CPU, memory, server count, etc. And I can provide a link for that at the end. But that wizard will ask you for things like the features that you would like to use in Lync and the number of users that would be using those features, the number of sites that you've got, whether everything's going to be on one site, etc., whether you need HA, high availability, and disaster recovery. It's a very good planning tool. So that's one to jot down, Lync planning tool. The next one we've got is hosted. Now this isn't by Microsoft, although Office 365 is a version of hosted. When we talk about hosted Lync, we're talking about someone like Nexus, the company I work for, hosting your Lync infrastructure for you. The benefits of doing it are obviously you don't have any maintenance, etc. You don't have to worry about keeping your own servers up to date. Typically, you don't need to buy hardware because this would be on a subscription cost that you pay perhaps monthly or yearly. So you do away with all those things, and you're ultimately just an end user that gets to experience the full benefits of Lync. Now, the hosted service that's offered will vary depending on the person that you go to who's offering the service. For example, provider A might not offer persistent chat, which we'll talk about later, whereas provider B might offer that. Provider A might not have the ability to connect your Lync environment to the public switch telephone network. So then you wouldn't be able to use it as a telephone replacement system, whereas provider B might offer you that. There might be different call charges for two providers that can offer you PSTN connectivity. So it's really a case, if you were to go down this route, to put the feelers out and kind of shortlist the features that you definitely require within Lync or would like, so mandatory requirements, and then nice to haves, and then go away and kind of explore the options that are available, what companies out there are doing hosted solutions, etc. And then they will come back with what they can and can't provide you, and then it's a case of obviously cross-referencing that against their monthly or yearly costing, etc. But the key difference is really you've got no on-premises equipment, and everything is taken care of for you. You don't have to worry about patching. You don't have to worry about employing someone as a Lync administrator or putting someone on a course to know how to administer Lync. These things typically come with support packages as well. So the hosted service will suit some people better than on-premises if they don't want to invest to the same degree, as it were. Office 365 or Lync Online is a flavor of hosted service. This is Microsoft hosting it for you. And we already know what services they can offer us. So if you took Lync with Office 365, they don't give you things like persistent chat, and there are one or two other features missing. Depending on the SKU of Office 365 that you subscribe to, whether it be E4, E3, or E1, etc., you'll get different features in those packages. Okay. Now, Microsoft do a good job of putting all these things into matrices and matrix, if you like. So you can look down a big long list that says E3 at the top, and you can see what Lync features you get, and then you can look at E1 and you can see what Lync features you don't get, etc. So once again, it's a case of shortlisting your requirements and then saying, okay, do we get that in an Office 365 subscription? This is suitable for a lot of people because many people do their licensing now through Office 365 for clients. A lot of people already have existing Office 365 subscriptions where they get Lync, but they're just not aware of the product or what they can leverage it for. So if you are one of those people and you think, yeah, we've got an Office 365 E3 subscription, but we're not using Lync, go away and find out why, because it's a free tool, and if nothing else, you can use it for instant messaging, and if you wanted to, PC to PC audio calling, conferencing, etc. The key kicker with Office 365 at the moment is no PSTN connectivity. So if you are planning on using Lync as a replacement phone system, then an Office 365 subscription won't do that for you. At this time, if you want to connect Lync to the PSTN, then your servers need to be on premises with you or with a hosting provider that can connect them for you. There's no way of connecting an Office 365 based or Lync Online based Lync environment to the PSTN. You can't call out to a mobile, for example. It's just not doable. There used to be a service or a provider a long time ago that would do that for you using a bridging technology. But they got so little uptake on their service and the prices were so extreme that no one really took it up, so they retired that service. And since that time, nothing has replaced it. The question is always asked why. Sometimes the most common answer seems to be that in doing so, Microsoft would put themselves forward as a telco or telephony company, and the legalities and administration around that would be quite large, and they'd be going into a different ballpark then. So that's kind of the most commonly accepted reason why they haven't made that jump yet. But given that Skype has PSTN connectivity, the backbone in the infrastructure is definitely there to do it. And Microsoft have always said for the last year that it's something on their roadmap to give PSTN connectivity to Office 365. So if this is something for you in the new year, where you're looking at planning sort of 12, 15 months in advance, then keep an eye on this one, because at some point PSTN connectivity will come with Office 365. When it does come, it won't have all the enterprise voice features that we've currently got on premises, and I'll talk about that later. And then the final flavor is hybrid. Of the ones we've talked about so far, you can have Lync on premises, and at the same time, you can have an Office 365 or hosted solution. And we do something called splitting the SIP domain, a split SIP domain. And that's where we have some of your users on premise and some in the cloud on a hosted service. Sounds a bit messy, but there are scenarios where it suits. For example, in education, where you might have 10,000 students and only 1,000 teachers, or 10,000 students, maybe 300 teachers. The students don't need PSTN connectivity, they don't need to make phone calls. So the subscription model and the cost of education licensing means it makes sense to put them in Office 365, where they can have instant messaging and presence and use the Lync client and use it for long distance learning. I can record things like we're doing now and provide it to them, and they can watch it, etc. But for the 200 or 300 teachers that need to be connected and make telephone calls, we already said they need to be on premise if we want to connect them to the PSTN network for mobile and landline calling. So that's where you might use a split domain or hybrid scenario, as it were. And hybrid isn't just related to Lync either. Hybrid also includes if I had a Lync deployment which was all on my own site, so on premises, but I already had Exchange Online, Office 365 Mail, then you'll see later how we use Exchange for voicemail and conversation history, etc. Well, there's no reason why we can't have our Exchange in the cloud and Lync on premises, and that would also be classed as a hybrid configuration because obviously we've got resources in the cloud and on premises. But those are your four flavors, if you like. On premises is kind of used for medium to large deployments, especially if they need PSTN connectivity. And then Office 365, perhaps if you're putting your toes in the water regarding Lync, you want to put it out there, or you just want to use instant messaging and presence, then Office 365 or a hosted solution, we seem to be, or see people take it up more in that regard. We're always just typing a message, so I'm interested to see if you can actually hear what I'm saying here. Okay, so those are the flavors, but underneath that, at the back end, regardless of which one you choose, whether it's on premises or a hosted solution, the servers in the background, the infrastructure in the back end doing all the work remain the same. So we're going to go through those now. And there's about 7, 8, or 9 back-end roles that are of note and importance. And these are the ones really that will enable you to sit down in a planning exercise or have someone sit down and talk Lync in front of you. And if you've got an understanding of these roles and you know the jargon that they're going to throw at you, then these roles, once you understand them, you know their names and you know what their purpose is, you can relate a lot more to any Lync conversation that might take place. So first off was the Lync front end. This is the core infrastructure of any Lync deployment. You can't have a Lync deployment without a Lync front end, but you could have one without any of the other servers if you chose to do so. So that when people sign into Lync, this is what they will be registering and authenticating against. It provides, as it says on the slide, instant messaging and presence using SIP. And it will be, or one of your Lync front-end servers, if you have more than one, will be nominated as the central management server or the central management store, which houses the blueprint of your entire Lync topology, if you like. Unlike previous conferencing solutions, where you'd have a separate server for conferencing, the conferencing components in Lync are actually deployed along with front end. You can split them out still, which we'll talk about on the conferencing slide later, but by default, when you deploy a front-end server, you get conferencing deployed with it. And there are a number of other services, such as response group service, which is to do with, on your current phone systems, you might have things like hunt groups, where you phone one number and multiple phones ring at once. Well, Lync jargon for that is response group, and well, that service runs on the front end as well. And as I mentioned, you get standard and enterprise options, with the only difference being whether it's going to be HA or not. How easy is it to change from one model to another, i.e. if we put our toes in the water and then decide to use Lync on another option? Okay, I wouldn't say it's easy, Roy, regarding that, but it's doable. There are recognized migration paths. So say, for example, you deployed Lync on premises, you trialed it as a phone system, it didn't really take off, but you really liked the IM and presence side of things, and you thought, okay, well, we could just migrate all this to the cloud, then that's doable as well. You can migrate from one to the other. In the same vein, the entire Lync model, if you like, the infrastructure is scalable as well. So if I deployed just a single front-end server for basic IM and presence, and then I decided I wanted high availability, there's no problem with me moving to 3 servers, and then I decided I wanted external access. There's no problem with me deploying the external access components, and then I deployed another site that needed Lync, but I didn't want the failure of the WAN between the 2 sites to cause a problem. I could deploy more Lync infrastructure at that site. The whole thing is scalable, and you can move back and forth between a hosted solution, and a Lync front-end solution. What I will say is migrating to a hosted solution other than 365, so a private provider, you'd be at their whim in terms of migrating from Office 365 or an on-premises deployment. Once again, when I mentioned the fact that some hosting providers will provide particular services, some hosting providers will provide the ability to migrate from an existing deployment, or they will say that it's greenfield and you need to go from scratch. That's something you need to look into with that particular hosting provider. Okay, so that's the Lync front end. So core component, you must deploy it. When you go through the planning and capacity wizard on the Microsoft tooling that you can download, which I'll provide the link for at the end, the first questions will be steered around how many users you have and what features you want. And the output of that will dictate how many front-end servers Microsoft think you need. I will say with that capacity planning tool, incidentally, that Microsoft, as with everything in the world, regardless of their product, are very generous when it comes to resourcing. So a standard edition front-end server, for example, they will tell you should have 32 gig of RAM on it. But realistically, when we're deploying servers in sort of 100, 200 user environments, we'll have that and put about 16 gig of RAM on. But that's based on experience and load and knowing that 32 gig is far in excess for 1 to 200 users. A single standard edition server, incidentally, will typically cater up to 6,600 users, but they say 5,000 users for a standard edition. So straight away, I know that 90% of people in this room, 5,000 users is probably well in excess of their own requirements. Okay, Lync Edge servers and reverse proxy, the next one along as well. These two kind of go hand in hand. Those two servers, Lync Edge and reverse proxy, will provide for you external access for your users. So if you deploy Lync internally and everyone loves it and they say this would be great if I could access it from a Premier Inn when I'm away in a hotel, or from home in my home office, or my mobile phone when I'm out and about, well, those are external access features. And if you want those, then you're going to leverage Lync Edge servers and a reverse proxy server. The Lync Edge server will also allow you to federate with other companies that use Lync. So for you guys to go on and deploy Lync, you'd then be able to federate with my company, Nexus Open Systems, and we'd have free IP calls between each other if you're using Lync for that. We'd have instant messaging between each other. We'd be able to see each other's presence, etc. So that type of functionality is a result of a Lync Edge server. It also allows external users to access, which is what I just talked about there. But additionally, anonymous users, which is what you guys are now in this environment. My infrastructure and myself, we aren't aware of you. You don't have accounts here or anything. You've clicked the link in a meeting invite and it's said to you, okay, if you have an account, sign in by all means. But if you don't, click here to join as a guest. And that's what you guys have done. And you've put in your names, some of you. So you're joining as anonymous users. Okay, once again, that's a feature of Lync Edge server. I mentioned the acquisition of Skype by Microsoft. So as soon as that was done, it made extreme sense to create some kind of integration between Lync and Skype. That's been there for a long time now. If you want to add Skype users to your Lync client so you can chat and IM between those and see their presence, then that's done through the Lync Edge server as well, okay? And at the bottom there it says public IP requirements. There's a slide in the next couple that talks about Edge server requirements, so I'll talk about that then. Reverse proxy, I said, is a complement to the Edge server. You wouldn't typically deploy just an Edge server because that would give you sort of 80% external access features. Pardon me. The reverse proxy will complement that and complete the feature set, take you to 100%. And it's the reverse proxy that gives you things like Lync mobility. So the Lync mobile app is available on Android, iPhone, and Windows Phone. Not available on BlackBerry, incidentally. But when you sign in, you'll be signing in through the reverse proxy on those mobile apps. Even if you're internal on your environment, the way Lync works is it will still use the reverse proxy to sign in to mobiles. It'll be your sign-in process on your mobile phone, even if you're internal on your wireless environment, will go out and back in again through the reverse proxy, okay? So regardless, even if you don't want to extend Lync to the outside your own boundaries, if someone says to you, I'd like to use a mobile app for Lync in the office, you still need a reverse proxy for that, okay? And then there are a number of underlying features such as the downloading of the address book, etc. that take place. Just users wouldn't notice externally, but the reverse proxy is leveraged for those. All a reverse proxy does, incidentally, is handle web requests. So it listens on 443, and any web request that comes in, it gets translated to a different port and then passed on to the front end server. Okay, mediation server. When you deploy your Lync front end server, the very first one there on the slide, the mediation server can be co-located with it. So it's quite feasible that if you deployed 3 front-end servers for high availability, every single one of those you could associate the mediation server role with as well. The mediation server is to do with voice and transcoding. When you place a call in Lync from a Lync user to another Lync user in your organization, it uses one type of codec. The audio is encoded. Now, if you were to place that same call to a mobile number or a landline number, then the PSTN doesn't use the same encoding. It uses a different codec. So something needs to translate that voice and audio stream into the right codec before it passes it out to the outside world. And that's layman terms or very high level overview for what the mediation server does. So it's involved with transcoding. Like it says there, translates signaling and media between Lync and the PSTN. Okay. So typically that can be co-located on the front end server and everything will just work. You can split it out as a separate server, and I'll talk about why you might want to do that on a later slide. But when people talk about mediation servers, just think transcoding of streams, because it's going from 2 places that use an uncommon codec, if you like. Okay, that's the first 4 done. The final 4, archiving and monitoring. So archiving and monitoring, we tend to bundle into the same sentence, and when people talk to you about Lync, they'll probably do that as well. The 2 components, archiving and monitoring, will leverage a SQL server. If you want to archive instant messaging and conferences, then that's archived in a SQL server. If you want to monitor the quality of your calls and the experience your end users are receiving, and you want to retain call detail records to see who called who when, then that also is stored on a SQL server. Regardless of what people tell you, you need a separate SQL server for this. You can't co-locate it with any other Lync role. There's nothing wrong with using an existing SQL server, creating a new instance on that server, and then deploying archiving and monitoring, or targeting archiving and monitoring to that server. Just be aware that if the server that you're going to deploy archiving and monitoring on is already in use for a business critical application, then you need to be very aware of what you're archiving and how long you're keeping it for and how quickly those databases will fill up. You don't want to sort of impact performance because of disk usage, utilization, etc. based on your archiving. If you've got 10,000 users and you're archiving all IM and conferences, you need to do a bit of capacity planning there. And that same capacity planning calculator I talked about at the beginning for the front end can also be used for archiving and monitoring purposes or archiving purposes. There's a slide later on with some indicative figures that I can show you. But like it says there, the agent resides on the front end server. So in Lync 2010, monitoring was a separate role. Can you use Azure SQL? No, that'll need to be on the same domain, Charles. Both archiving and monitoring agents reside on front-end servers. Okay, yeah. So typically in 2010, monitoring was a separate role. So people migrating away from 2010, if you're on that at the moment, those agents now are bundled into the front-end server. So I talked at the beginning how the front-end server co-locates a number of roles, including mediation. Well, archiving and monitoring agents are one of those now as well. And like it says at the bottom, requires SQL for storage. Exchange unified messaging. There are a number of features in Lync that rely on Exchange for functionality. As an example, conversation history for the end users, if they want to see a full breakdown of who they called and when, etc. That's integrated into the user's mailbox, so that's tied in with Exchange. Voicemail functionality, as another example, is a part of or is dependent on Exchange. So it needs to be Exchange 2010 or Exchange 2013. You can use Exchange 2007 with a limited feature set for Exchange Unified Messaging. As an example of the limited feature that you might get, if you use voicemail in Lync, some of the phones that you deploy on desks will have a message waiting indicator on the top right corner of the phone. Well, if you use Exchange 2007 for voicemail, then you won't get the message waiting indicator notifications on the phone. So it's minor limitations such as that. There's an increased degree of complexity during the deployment and configuration. So if you're considering doing this yourself, just be aware of that Exchange 2007 isn't as natively friendly when it comes to integration as 2010 and 2013 are. It says there actually Lync voicemail services dependent on Exchange Unified Messaging, which is true. Auto attendance services with Lync, Lync has native functionality to provide auto attendance services. So when you phone up and you get an audio greeting saying, "Hi, the office is now closed," or "Hi, for sales press 1, for accounting press 2, etc." Lync can do that natively for you. But Exchange Unified Messaging also has that functionality, and the Exchange version of it enables you to dial by extension. So where you sometimes hear the prompt that says, "If you know the person's extension number, then please dial it now," that's Exchange Auto Attendant doing that, not Lync Auto Attendant. So once again, during planning and deployment, although it's a little bit off the track here, when it comes to your attendance services and your voice flow and your greetings, etc., you need to clearly define either what your existing call flow is or what you want your new one to be. And at that point, either a consultant or yourself can determine whether Lync Auto Attendant services will suffice or whether you need something like dial by extension, so you're going to use Exchange Auto Attendant services. Exchange Unified Messaging also allows you to have subscriber access numbers as well, or Outlook voice access as it's got up there. So where you dial a number while you're out on the road, it's a public unique number, so you dial it from a mobile phone, etc., and it says to listen to your emails, press 1. You have no new voicemails, etc. You can query your calendar, etc. That's all done through subscriber access. Okay. Persistent chat is a feature of Lync which commonly isn't deployed out the box because it's one of those things where there isn't always a business requirement for it. Persistent chat is like instant messaging, but like it says on the tin, it persists over time. If you think of the old school MSN chat rooms and Yahoo chat rooms where you could join a chat room and there'd be loads of people in there already and you could type content and everyone else would see it, it's exactly that. But when you leave the room and go back in there again, that same content is still there. So you could upload files, etc., and those files would be retained there and people could go in. So it's a very informal meeting space, perhaps informal document management or project management to a degree, but typically we find that people have better document management systems such as SharePoint or an in-house solution, which kind of negates the requirement for persistent chat. We don't use it here as an example at Nexus, although we have it deployed. And I looked the other day and there are perhaps 4 or 5 rooms, because you create rooms in persistent chat, and there's very little content in them. But if you have a requirement to create a chat space or a meeting space that will persist over time, that you can lock down with permissions, that you can say who can do what in those rooms, then persistent chat is worth exploring for you. Okay. Enable multi-party topic-based chat, it says there, which is kind of worded better than how I just explained it. And it says that it can be co-located with a standard edition server, which it can. But if you deploy front-end enterprise servers, then you can't co-locate it with enterprise edition front-end servers. It needs to be a separate dedicated persistent chat server. Toby, does Exchange also need to be on-site, or is a hosted 365 implementation satisfactory? Good question. At the beginning, when I talked about the hybrid solution, I mentioned that splitting Lync between on-premise and in the cloud is not the only iteration of hybrid. Hybrid can also be considered as a pure Lync deployment on-site and then your Exchange solution hosted. So in answer to your question, yes, you could have Lync on-premises and you could have Exchange in the cloud, and you could connect to that and use that for unified messaging. That's not a problem at all. And vice versa as well. You could have Exchange on premises and Lync in the cloud, and then for your Exchange dependencies, point that back down to your on-premises Exchange environment. So you can have one or the other hybrid scenario. Director. Okay, the director is an optional role. In the professional world of Lync, we typically don't deploy this. I don't know why. We kind of steered away from it. I think the inbuilt security mechanisms within Lync suffice in terms of, well, if I explain what it's used for, then you'll see why. But the idea of a director is it sits between your user community and the outside world and your front-end servers. The idea being that it does all the authentication and everything, and you sign into against the director rather than the front-end server. And why might you choose to do this? Well, there is a thought that Lync is susceptible to DDoS attacks, for example. If someone knows your username and password, they could attempt to sign in as you externally over and over and over again, and then ultimately lock out your AD account by doing so. So the idea of perimeter security is to try and prevent things like that. So there are security filter packs we deploy on the edge server, and along with that, some people deploy the director role, so that the authentication and the signing process is done against the director. Now, if someone swamps your director and they bring it to its knees, your internal front-end servers that are hosting your internal conferences and everything that's going on in your corporate environment, they're unaffected because it's the director that's been crippled by the hassle that people are calling from the external world, if you like. So that's the purpose of a director. Typically, there's not really a reason for it to be deployed. We've got at the bottom there, typically omitted of late is the final bullet point on that slide. And that's very true. I've never deployed a director. No one's ever asked me for one, despite security consultants, etc. And typically, if things like external access and security and threat are a problem for you, then there are other products that you can deploy on the edge server that will take care of that for you and mitigate threat, as it were. But know of it, because some people do deploy it, and it is a viable role. It's still in TechNet, it's still a recognized role, and it can still be deployed if required. Most useful to enhance security and deployments that provide external access, yeah, which is pretty much what we said. Okay, I think that's all the major server roles, but I just wanted to go over those because now if you were to engage in a conversation and people threw up the most complex Lync diagram in the world, regardless of how complex it was, how many sites it was, and how many servers were involved, those servers will fall into one of the components that we talked about there, typically anyway. And hopefully you'll have an understanding, if you didn't already have one, about what they might be used for, etc. Okay. This next slide talks about external access and mobility. So on this slide there in front of you, you can see that we've got servers that we've already talked about. We've got 2 standard edition servers. We've got an Office Web App server, which I'll talk about shortly, Exchange server. There's a gateway connecting that internal environment out to the public switch telephone network. And we'll talk about survivable branch appliances as well. But all that really isn't relevant to the slide. What I want to look at is the edge server and the reverse proxy that we've got sat between our 2 firewalls there. Now you recall it's those 2 servers that provide external access to your Lync environment. They provide federated access to other companies and to Skype, for example, which is what it says on the bullet points on the left. Now, Microsoft will always tell you that you should sit these in a true DMZ between 2 firewalls. So you can see on the diagram there is a first firewall, and then there's the edge server and the reverse proxy, and then a second firewall, and then your internal LAN. Typically in small environments, or should I say, we only really tend to see back-to-back firewalls of that nature in secure environments or large-scale, medium to large-scale deployments or infrastructures. What we find more often with smaller environments, and when I say small, I still mean several thousand users, which Lync will class as small, is they will just have a single firewall, which is okay, and then the edge and the reverse proxy sat behind that, and then going directly onto the LAN. Now that is a supported topology, but just be aware that from a security perspective and everything you read, Microsoft will always tell you that your edge and reverse proxy will sit between 2 firewalls like that. But don't think that when you go away, don't think, oh, we haven't got 2 firewalls, we can't deploy edge and reverse proxy. It can be done. There's just a slightly more, the security footprint is a little slightly smaller and risk is slightly larger, obviously, in terms of a security perspective. But the best thing to do is if you have a single firewall and you want external access and you want to deploy edge and reverse proxy, then sit down with someone like myself or someone here at Nexus, and we can tell you the most secure way in which you can go about doing that. Some of you might already have Lync deployments already where you're using a single firewall and it's perfectly supported, it's perfectly okay. But there's a good way to go about configuring that. Okay, requirements for external access. These are the things that normally catch people out and prevent people from deploying edge and reverse proxy and external access. The first bullet point is a given. You need to make sure that you've got the server resources to deploy those components. Capacity planning and high availability requirements. What they mean there is, for some companies, a large majority of their workforce will be working remotely or externally, maybe in excess of 50%. If that's the case for you, then it can be considered that your edge servers are quite business critical in terms of servers and the importance they have on your infrastructure. So in Lync, we tend to provide resilience and high availability by something called pooling, and that's relevant to almost all rules. And by that we mean, if you want resilience, then we simply add more servers to the pool. So if you had a large workforce outside your perimeter network and you needed to make sure that they were always able to use Lync, all we simply need to do is add more servers to the edge pool for resilience. So typically you might have a single edge server because external access is a nice to have or a bonus feature if you like. But as soon as external access becomes business critical, then you need to start looking at high availability of your edge servers in your Lync environment. Now, single edge server will cater for 12,000 users. So capacity isn't normally a problem when it comes to edge servers. It's more so the high availability in the event that an edge server goes down. How do people access the Lync infrastructure? Or you need to do maintenance on an edge server. How do you bring it down? When's a convenient time to bring an edge server down? Okay, given that out of hours doesn't always mean out of hours with Lync, because people tend to access of an evening, overnight, etc. More so than during the day, because that's when they're at home or away from work. The capacity planning calculator also has questions and guidance once you provide numbers, usage scenarios, etc. on the number of servers that they will recommend. And typically you'll find that come out at 2 for small to medium. But if you have large organizations or extremely sensitive to external access, business and federation, then you might find that that's 3 or 4 servers. As with everything, not just Lync, when it comes to external access, we tend to cater for security through digital certificates. Now, ordinarily, we'd use a public certificate, but you can use internally generated certificates to secure your Lync Edge server. There are pros and cons of each. Naturally, a public certificate is typically trusted by almost all devices. So my iPhone, for example, trusts people like DigiCert, GoDaddy, VeriSign, etc. It trusts certificates that come from them, from their root certificate authority. But we all know, or the majority of us, that public certificates aren't free. And with Lync, you're typically looking at something like a 5 to 10 SAN certificate. So with GoDaddy, that'll come out at sort of £600, £700. Someone like VeriSign, I think maybe is like £1,200, etc. And you'd use that to secure your external Lync environment, your public-facing edge external interfaces and services. But you don't have to. You could use internal certificates. So say, for example, I was a laptop user at work, and when I went home, I was going to use that same laptop to connect externally. Well, that's fine, because my laptop will probably trust the internal root certificate authority. So I can use internal certificates to secure my edge services. The problem with that is, as soon as I pick up a different PC or a different laptop that doesn't have the root certificate on for my internal environment, it's not going to trust that certificate that's being presented by the edge server. Okay, so if you have lots of people who take laptops home and that's all they're ever going to use for Lync, then you could get away with external access for that particular scenario. But if you're going to have things like federation, people using mobile phones, people using uncommon devices, etc., then you're going to need a public certificate. So typically we'd always recommend public certificates, But for the purposes of testing and trialing, perhaps you might use an internal certificate for your edge services. When people sign in to Lync externally, so whether it's from a hotel, etc., or their mobile phone, they're going to query public DNS records to find out where they're meant to go. As part of the deployment, naturally, we create a number of public DNS records. So when a device is trying to sign in to Ben Donaldson at nexusos.co.uk, my Lync client will go to nexusos.co.uk and look for something in that namespace to steer me to my Lync environment. So naturally, you need to have control of your own public namespace, or at least be able to put requests into whoever owns and manages that for you, so they can add additional A records and service records, etc., to the public namespace. Almost hand in hand with certificates, there's a public IP address requirement for external access. A lot of Lync traffic utilizes port 443. Now, lots of things like to use port 443 when they're coming in externally. So we need dedicated IP addresses so that we can have 443 for ourselves for Lync services. Now you need at least one public IP for edge services, but we recommend 3 public IPs, as does Microsoft. The reason for this is that there are 3 edge services that exist: Access Edge, Web Conferencing Edge, and AV Edge. If we have 3 public IPs, one for each of those services, then we can use port 443 for each of them, because the port and IP address combination is unique. That's good, because if I'm at a hotel and I sign into Lync, you bet your bottom dollar that 443 will be allowed outbound, and I won't have any problems using Lync externally from my hotel room. So that's using 3 public IP addresses. If IP addresses are a problem for you, we can use a single public IP address, but we naturally can't use port 443 for all those services on the same public IP because they're not unique then. So what we do is, if we use a single public IP, we need to change the ports that are being used for 2 of those services. So one will continue to use 443, and then the other 2 will use 5061 and 444. Now the problem with that is when I go to my Premier Inn, typically 443 is allowed outbound. That's fine because that's common knowledge in the IT world, but they might not be allowed 444 out, and they might not be allowing 5061 out. So right there, I'm going to be stung in terms of Lync functionality and some things not working, etc. Now, if you're aware of that, that's fine. But once again, in terms of planning consideration, straight away, when people see that decision, they're like, oh yeah, we'll go for one IP address because public IPs are rare or a big deal to some companies. And if you can use 1 over 3, then that's straight away what they go for. But you need to be aware of the impact that might have when it comes to external access. And it is predominantly because of that. Wherever you don't know where your users are signing in from, so you can't predict whether the port requirements are going to be in place or the outbound allowances are going to be in place from where they're signing in from. Okay. Load balancing multiple edge servers. We can DNS load balancing across most of Lync, 95% of it, and that includes edge servers. So if you did deploy 2 edge servers, those DNS records that I talked about, where we look in the public domain namespace to see where we're meant to sign in, all we simply do is create duplicates of those records with a different set of IPs for the second edge server. And if we had 3 edge servers, then we create a third set of duplicate DNS records with another set of IPs, and it will just be DNS round robin across your edge servers. That said, if you wanted to use a hardware load balancer, then you can use a hardware load balancer to balance edge services as well. You'll notice in the diagram that we looked at, the edge servers sit in the DMZ, so they'll have an external interface pointing out to the outside world and an internal interface pointing to the inside world. The only thing to bear in mind regarding load balancing is you must use the same load balancing technology for both internal and external interfaces on the edge. So you can't DNS load balance all your internal client requests on the edge server and then choose to hardware load balance your external requests. It must be hardware load balancing for everything on your edge or DNS load balancing for everything on your edge. You can't have hardware on one side and DNS load balancing on the other side. Another thing to bear in mind with hardware load balancing is it doesn't support NATing to private IP addresses. So the 3 public IPs I mentioned, if you're going to have 2 edge servers and you're going to hardware load balance that, you need a total of 6 public IPs for your 2 edge servers, 3 on each, and then your hardware load balancer needs 3 public IP addresses as well. What I want you to take away from that is hardware load balancing requires more public IP addresses. That's all you need to be aware of at this stage without going too granular. One of the biggest problems we have when it comes to actually configuring and setting up external access, predominantly any problem always comes down to a firewall rule or port forwarding rule. So the bullet point third from bottom there talks about appliance control with your firewalls, your routers, etc. You need to be able to either make those changes yourself or ask someone to investigate port forwarding or NAT, etc., and have them change it at a consultant's request or at your request. You need to have the ability to make changes on those devices. DMZ scenarios are already touched on. And finally, reverse proxies. The reverse proxy was the server we said worked hand in hand with the edge server. And I said that it just deals with web service requests. It's not a link role as such. It doesn't exist. You won't ever be looking at any anything in the link control panel that says reverse proxy because it's not a link role. The reverse proxy listens on port 443 and it takes traffic that hits it on 443 from the outside world and then passes it to the link server on a different port on 4443, so an extra 4. That's all its job is, port translation. That's essentially what it does. It needs a public IP address as well, 1 public IP address. Now, it's not a link role, and the reason for that is there are many technologies and devices that can act as a reverse proxy for you. Like I said, it's just doing port translation. So you could deploy a Microsoft Server 2012 operating system, install IIS on it, and install something called the mind blank, I'll tell you in a moment, application request routing component on the IIS, and that has the ability to do port translation. And that's, other than the cost of the operating system, that's essentially free. But you might already have a Kemp load balancer or a NetScaler. Those devices can do port translation for you as well. So it's a requirement more than a role, and it can be fulfilled by a number of devices on the market at the moment. If you've got stuff in your perimeter network and you're thinking, well, can that be our reverse proxy? Then have a quick Google. See if it can do reverse proxy and port translation. If it can, there's probably already a documented guide on using that in Lync. Okay. And I said that needed a public IP address. So when we break it down, because we said it works with edge server and reverse proxy in tandem, that's a minimum of at least 2 public IP addresses. 1 for edge server, 1 for reverse proxy. But best practice and recommendation, it's a minimum of 4 public IP addresses. 3 for your edge server, 1 for your reverse proxy. Okay. Now, external access and planning, we could talk all day about it because there are a number of scenarios. But I hope that gives you a kind of insight into the considerations and control you'll need over particular elements regarding external access. Okay. Archiving and monitoring. Okay. Mentioned at the beginning when we were talking about the role itself and its dependency on a SQL server. And we talk about them together all the time, typically, monitoring, archiving, and compliance, it says there. So in Lync, we have the ability to archive instant messages. We have the ability to archive conferences. We don't archive voice calls. Lync isn't a call recording solution per se. The monitoring aspect of it monitors the quality of our calls, who called who, and when they called them. You can look at the monitoring reports, and they're quite granular. They will give you a set of metrics that are color coordinated. They will tell you packet loss, jitter, round trip time, etc. And Lync has metrics that it considers acceptable and not acceptable. So if you have a poor call and a user calls you and says, hey, you know what, the last 3 calls I've made, absolutely shocking, really poor jitter, I couldn't hear the guy at the other end. You'd fire up your monitoring reports, you'd open and expand the call that he made, because he'd tell you what time he made it and the number he was calling, so that makes it traceable. And then the metrics, it would be evident from Lync. Lync would color coordinate those metrics. Anything that it wasn't happy with would be in bright red. So if jitter was unacceptable, then the jitter metric for that particular call would be in red. If everything in there looks fine, then Lync knows it looks fine. Then you need to start looking at things like the provider, where that call is coming in from, etc. But that's all done in the monitoring. So call detail records there, it says usage, statistics, trends, quality of service. We would always deploy monitoring reports if we're deploying Lync as a phone solution. Because as I alluded, the scenario and example I alluded to there, when someone calls up and says, I've had a bad call, the first place you go is monitoring reports. So it's very naive to deploy Lync voice as a phone solution without monitoring reports. It would be against every recommendation I would ever make. Archiving, on the other hand, if you don't have any compliance or regulatory requirements, or you don't feel the need to archive instant messaging, then you can forgo that role if you choose. Typically, we see it deployed anyway, just because of a number of usage scenarios. For example, if a user came to you and said, look, I'm being bullied in instant messaging on a daily basis, yes, they'd be able to show you their own instant messaging history, but if you've got an archive of that, then regardless of who deletes what on the user side, you've got something to fall back on. In the military and legal industries, we see that it's typically a requirement and a compliance requirement anyway. How long you hold on to that data is up to you, and as I said before at the beginning, that will affect the usage footprint on disk size, etc. The usage scenarios there, 80 kilobytes per user per day for monitoring and 60 per user per day, are based on Microsoft usage models or user models. If you were to jump on Google and look on TechNet at the average typical usage models for Microsoft, you'll see that they're probably in excess of your own. Everyone in their usage scenario seems to be hyperactive on the phone and instant messaging. But if you look at that and take the 80 kilobits and 60 kilobits, you can quickly do the math, and you'll see that the footprint or the disk space required isn't really that great, even if you were to hold on to it for quite a lengthy period of time. It will give you an overall view of disk requirements and space requirements, etc. on SQL, but then you can go on from there to say, look, okay, we don't need to apply archiving to everyone, we just need to apply it to these individuals. Perhaps you need to retain archiving of instant messages and conferences longer for some people than for others. Then you'd create different archiving policies and associate those to different sets of users. So the Microsoft planning tool, I guess what I'm trying to say is just be very aware that it's quite a global, high-level overview. It asks you how many users you've got, and then once you put that in, it'll give you typical disk utilization and consumption. But you can go away and be a bit more granular with that and say, okay, that's fine, but we're not going to archive for these people, and we're only going to hold on to it for this amount of time, etc. And then it's a simple case of multiplying your daily usage by the amount of time that you're going to hold on to it, and that's your disk growth, okay? The only thing to bear in mind with that is the SQL server that you're going to put this on, just be wary of putting it on another SQL server that might have business critical applications on, particularly if your Lync deployment is greenfield, or you're fresh into a Lync deployment, as it were, then you don't have any historical data or trend to go on. So you don't want to saturate a SQL server that's being used for existing business critical applications, okay? Just be very aware of that. Persistent chat we talked about, a feature that's not commonly deployed out the box, but that some people have a requirement for. In terms of planning and consideration, it's a separate scope on its own. You sit down and you will need to define a high-level overview of what you think the persistent chat rooms are that you require and who would require access to those rooms. The control and access to the rooms is done on a policy base, on a granular level. So once again, you create persistent chat room policies and you associate them to users. You can nominate managers of rooms. Those managers can have different permissions, so they can dictate who has access to those rooms. They can dictate who can post into those rooms or just has read-only access to those rooms. So it's all quite granular on that level. A single persistent chat server will cater for up to about 20,000 users, and you can have a pool of 4, which will take you up to 80,000 users. I mentioned earlier that when we're trying to cater for high availability in Lync, we simply add more servers to the existing one and create a pool. Persistent chat is a single exception to that rule. You can have up to 4 servers in a persistent chat room, but the disaster recovery scenario for persistent chat is you have inactive servers. So you have active, inactive. So if I deployed 4 persistent chat servers for 80,000 users to access persistent chat, that's as high as I can go. Even if I deployed another 4, they would be redundant servers. They'd be inactive in that environment. Typically, persistent chat is only deployed for informal usage, so we don't see a great deal of requirement regarding high availability and disaster recovery. But that's not to say that you wouldn't end up using this as a business critical application. So just be aware that the mechanism by which HA and DR is achieved in persistent chat, the architecture is slightly different, and it'll be a separate planning process, but it can be done and it can be made highly available and part of the DR plan as well. It uses a stretched pool for disaster recovery. So if we had 2 sites, site A and site B, and you wanted all those users to have persistent chat, we'd have some servers in site A and some in site B. So the pool would be stretched over the data centers. There's consideration there for companies whose data is quite sensitive in terms of regulation and compliance. If all your data needs to reside on home soil in your data center, then be aware that a topology that someone might propose to you for high availability and disaster recovery might involve having those servers off in a different data center, perhaps on different soil or different geographic location. That wouldn't suffice in that scenario, which is what the bottom point is alluding to there. You have no control over where your data is going to sit. It might be in a persistent chat room that's honed on a server in the States, when legally we're obliged to keep that data in the UK. But once again, that would all come out in the planning process of persistent chat. And just be aware that the topology is slightly different regarding HA and disaster recovery. Conferencing. I talked about how conferencing is no longer a separate dedicated server, and it's co-located when we deploy that core component of Lync, the front-end server. There are a number of different types of conferencing available in Lync. Dial-in conferencing, which some of you are using now, I can see on the screen on the left, where you dial in from the PSTN. It says enter your conference ID, you put your conference ID in, and it takes you into the conference. That's dial-in conferencing, traditional conferencing from the PSTN. We can have web conferencing, which is what some of you are also involved in. In fact, you've got a web browser open, you're listening to me via a web browser, you're looking at content, etc. That's web conferencing. AV conferencing, audio video, that's traditional video conferencing solutions. So some of the Polycom devices that you see where you go in and all of a sudden you've got audio and video, that's AV conferencing. And in Lync we have IM conferencing as well. You don't have to have any content or video, you could just have 5 people in an instant message. That's also deemed conferencing. Office web app requirement, second bullet point down. For those of you that joined this meeting through a web browser, it may or may not have been obvious to you that a plugin was installed in the background, the Office web app plugin, that enables you to experience this through a web browser. That's a feature of Lync 2013. Traditionally, in Lync 2010, you would need to download the Lync 10D software, install that on your PC, and that would be used to take you into the web conference that we're in now. So Lync has come a long way from 2010 to 2013. But the Office web app component is what takes you in through this web browser experience, if you like. It's a user-side install. It's very quick. I doubt anyone was sitting around waiting for progress bars, etc. But you just need to be aware that if you have a very locked down environment and your clients are very locked down, when they're trying to access web conferences externally, it's going to do that user-side install for that plugin. Okay, so that needs to be allowed. That will obviously come out in any piloting that you do and planning, etc. Server requirements for conferencing. I mentioned that this is all co-located on the front-end server anyway, but there is a means to split out the conferencing role per se onto a dedicated server. And why might we want to do that? Well, this meeting we're in now will take up to 250 users. We could have many more people join us. So that's 250 users in a standard Lync conference when it's co-located with the front-end server, which is what happens by default. But if we were doing regular webinars and I was talking to sort of 800-900 people, that would be considered a large meeting. And the recommendation is to split the conferencing section out onto a dedicated server for that. We deploy a separate front-end server, no users on it, purely dedicated for conferencing. and that will cater for users up to, or for meetings up to 1,000 users in size. So if you want to host webinars, etc., and you know they're going to be large, then you should be looking at large meeting accommodation, which would be a dedicated conferencing server. Anything up to 250, then you can keep it co-located on the front-end server. The meeting that we're in now, for example, is co-located on our front-end server, and it's performing fine. The biggest problem with Lync conferencing, and this is kind of applicable to Lync as a whole really, is the end user experience, understanding and training. I've seen many times where people will think, yes, we've now got this fully fledged conferencing solution on everyone's desktop, but the degree of end user training hasn't been enough to leverage that in any sufficient way, as it were. And people get upset because they have a bad experience. They're trying to join the meeting. They don't really know what's going on. For example, the people joining this meeting today that had problems, that's understandable because you've received a random invite that you've just clicked. But if that was to happen on go live after a Lync deployment, there's no real excuse for that. The problem with it is it tarnishes people's perception of the product. And you bet your bottom dollar that someone that's made a fool of themselves trying to organize a meeting in front of 25 people won't try and organize a meeting again, ever, because their confidence won't be there, and they'll be afraid of making a fool of themselves when they're trying to set up a large meeting again. So end user training and understanding is key, and is definitely a consideration. Although end user training is part of deployment consideration and planning anyway, particular weight should always be placed on conferencing, because it's one of those features that will save the business time, money, and streamline business processes once everyone's using it. If everyone knew how to set up and use a conference, everything would be streamlined. You don't get these trips where people are coming in from remote offices just to attend a Friday meeting anymore and then writing off the rest of the day because they've got to travel back. Ad hoc conferences can be done on the fly, but it's all based around user confidence and understanding of the conferencing solution that they've got. Conferencing hardware, I mentioned briefly then that once you deploy Lync, everyone essentially has a conferencing solution in front of them anyway. If they've got a laptop with a webcam in it, they've got a fully fledged video conferencing solution with mic. But there are other solutions out there, particularly by people like Polycom, Smart and Lifesize, etc., that specialize in dedicated conferencing hardware for conference rooms, etc. On the slide there, for example, that's a Lync room system, and that is actually the budget Lync room system. That's bottom of the price range. The Lync room system solutions scale right up to twin displays, all touch screen, well over 80 inches in diameter, with remote control tablets, etc. So if you have dedicated conferencing rooms that executives use, then you might look at something like a Lync room system, which is a solution built around Lync, has native Lync, its own client built into it, and is the smoothest conference solution that you can get on a Lync environment. Naturally, they're not cheap, so if you have informal meeting spaces or conference rooms, then there are other conferencing devices out there from people like Polycom. The spider phones that you traditionally see on some PBX solutions, they're available for Lync as well. They can be left in common areas or conference rooms. There's a lot of hardware out there when it comes to conferencing, a lot of devices. There's a slide coming up that has some vendors on it, and that's just a snippet of the amount of vendors that are involved in developing hardware and conferencing hardware for the Lync environment. Okay, for example, the device I'm using for this now is a small portable conferencing device, plug and play USB. So in terms of planning and deployment, conferencing is sometimes something that's considered an afterthought once people realize the power that's available in Lync, and then they say, okay, yeah, we should replace our existing conferencing room solutions with a Lync version of that. And there's no reason why you can't preempt that and look at what conferencing solutions are available when you deploy Lync in the first interim. Okay, this is quite an important slide. I mentioned at the beginning, Lync is a unified communications platform and a viable telephony replacement solution as well. So we can do rip and replace on your existing phone system, or we can have Lync sit side by side and you can do a phased migration where you gradually move people over. What you see on the right in that rather crude slide is typically what you'd have in most environments that are running a traditional phone system. PSTN, or the public switch telephone network, which comes into your current PBX, and then off your PBX, you have all your desk phones. That's quite straightforward. If we were going to implement Lync, pretty sure that arrow was meant to disappear. We'll carry on. If we're going to implement Lync, typically the way we prefer to do it and best practice is to use a side-by-side migration. But to do this, we introduce an additional component between your existing PBX and the telephone network. And this might be a session border controller or a gateway. Two of the main vendors in this field are Sonos and Audio Codes. Nexus use Audio Codes. For the purposes of this, there's no great deal of difference between the two, but for the sake of familiarity and partnership, etc., we've always gone with Audio Codes. So we introduced this gateway, or this SBC, between the PSTN and your current phone system. We configure it in pass-through mode, so your PBX is blissfully unaware that anything's changed. A call that comes in for Joe Bloggs, sat on his phone, will come in from the PSTN, go straight through that SBC or gateway, hit your PBX, and behave as normal. But now we've introduced that gateway, it affords us the luxury of being able to hang Lync off the side. And then we can naturally provision Lync users on the Lync environment. At this point, you've created a platform that's available for a phased migration. You could enable a user on Lync, enable them for enterprise voice, and we can configure the SBC or the gateway to route calls for that user to Lync instead of the current PBX system. If you think of the SBC or the gateway as a routing hub with spokes coming off it, in this case it's just the two spokes, the legacy PBX and Lync. But if Joe Bloggs' number was 123 and that came in from the PSTN, it hits the gateway, and we can have a rule that says anything going to 123, pass it to Lync. Or alternately, if Joe Bloggs was still on the old system, we'd say anything for 123, pass it to the legacy PBX. So that's how it siphons off and differentiates between incoming calls to the two different systems. But this also works internally. So perhaps a Lync user calls somebody who's on the legacy PBX. The same logic applies. The call will hit the routing table on the gateway, and the gateway will say, I know that number, it resides on the legacy PBX, and pass it internally. If it doesn't recognize it, or there's no rule for it, then it will just pass it out to the PSTN, and then the call is established between the Lync user and the number that he dialed in the big outside world. So it's very basic. It's a very high level overview, this, by the way, but the concept is straightforward. The introduction of an additional piece of equipment or hardware allows us to conduct this phased migration. Now, the upfront costs that you sometimes associate with a Lync deployment are those of licensing, things like the licensing for the Lync servers, etc., and the resources that you need. But there are lots of hidden costs. For example, if you had 1,000 users and your handset of choice for Lync cost £100, then all of a sudden there's a massive cost there. So perhaps that's not in line with budgetary requirements at that time. So you might choose to phase people over to the new Lync system in line with budget as it becomes available. Or you might choose to phase people over as part of a rollout plan. Perhaps you've got multiple buildings or offices and you think, okay, we're going to move building A all over to Lync in January. So you migrate that geographical location or office block over to Lync. All the while you're retaining interoperability between Lync and the current PBX system. Now, you don't have to do that. You can go big bang. You can deploy Lync and then migrate everyone's numbers onto Lync, engage with your phone, engage with your user community, tell them, make sure the adequate training is in place, etc. But everyone associates big bang with a bit of risk. There's no rollback option. Yes, you have the rollback option of being able to unplug Lync and put the legacy PBX hardware back in, but that's not the experience that we like to try and undergo, as it were. We want a nice phased migration. This also offers you the opportunity to perhaps pilot something like instant messaging, and you don't want to use Lync as a telephony system. This will allow you to use instant messaging and presence and get people familiar with the client, all the while having their old desk phone next to them. And then once people are familiar with that, then you can migrate over to Lync as a telephony solution. One of the biggest problems we have with Lync is the size of the feature set. So a phased migration such as IM pilot, rollout, production, and then introduction of telephony seems to be a lot more friendlier than just dropping a massive feature set in front of a user and go, there you go, you have a unified communications platform solution now. There's a lot of training involved there. There's a steep learning curve. Adoption isn't as streamlined as it were if you phase the migration, okay? But depending on your infrastructure, your own environments, you'll know what will be suited better than myself. Some of the points on the left then that it talks about. Capacity planning. One of the things that we see when people migrate to Lync for Voice is you might have an ISDN 30 line coming in at the moment to your organization with 30 channels of ISDN. But are you really using all those 30? Traditionally, people don't really care. They pay the same ongoing cost. They're in a contract, and they just pay for 30, even though at any given time they might be using a maximum of 8, 9, or 10. The introduction of Lync as a telephony system is a good time to review how much you're paying your service provider for and the number of channels that you're subscribing to. It's one of those things that people don't typically review and change accordingly. They see it as a fixed cost, and that's the cost they'll pay forever or until their contract runs out. So this is a good time to review the number of channels that you have connecting you to the PSTN. Exchange Unified Messaging Integration. I mentioned that Lync will use Exchange for voicemail. So when someone leaves you a voicemail, that gets delivered to the user's mailbox. If you have a desk phone that has a message waiting indicator on it, then that's Exchange. It will make that phone light up and tell you you've got a message, etc. So if you want voicemail on your voice solution, once again, that's dependent on integration with Microsoft Exchange. Response groups and call flow. I also mentioned when I was talking about Exchange about how the press 1 for sales, 2 for accounting functionality works in Lync and how Lync can do that for you. But Exchange can do it as well. And there's a planning discussion around which one you would use for your response groups and call flow. Response groups, incidentally, are what you might already understand as hunt groups, where you call one number and it makes many phones ring at once. Well, that's a response group in Lync, or what Microsoft tend to jargon as a response group. So all those types of things would need to be brought out in the WAS when it comes to planning and voice and call flow, etc. as well. Typically, we try to mimic what's already in play on the legacy PBX, but once again, hunt groups and things, they're not something that gets reviewed regularly. So it's an opportunity to redefine your hunt groups and your response groups when you migrate to Lync. Private lines is a feature of Lync. Everyone has a single telephone number. In Lync, you can only have one number, but we can also allocate private lines for individuals. So say, for example, you had an executive management individual who didn't like to give out his phone number to people. He just wanted to give out his number to select individuals. Then he might give them a private line number. That's hidden from the address book, so only those individuals would be able to call him on that number. Location-based routing. If you imagine you've got multiple offices with Lync deployed, one in the USA, one in the United Kingdom, and we've deployed a Lync environment in each of those offices. So you have Lync servers in the USA and Lync servers in the UK, and we've deployed one of these SBCs or gateways in each of those sites. We can do something called location-based routing or least cost routing, where if a UK user dials an American number, rather than it break out in the UK and incur the cost of an international call, it will go across our Lync infrastructure and across the WAN and break out at the gateway in America, and then it would be the cost of a local call, etc. That would all come out obviously in the topology design and the planning, and is purely dependent on the number of offices you have and where they are, etc. When you're considering deploying and using Lync for an enterprise voice solution, it's important that you have a good understanding of how users use their telephones. It sounds quite straightforward, but some people are in the habit of dialing 6-digit numbers on their own. Other people are in the habit of dialing the full digit number area code as well, so 01392 468 Other people, believe it or not, still dial international +44 numbers. So you need to have an understanding of the habits that exist in your user community so that we can cater for those in Lync. The reason for this is Lync works on something called E164 numbers. It needs everything in +44 followed by the number in terms of the UK. So international code followed by the number. So you need to know your dialing habits of your users, whether they just dial 6-digit numbers, etc., or the full area code, so that we can normalize and translate those numbers into fully 164 formatted numbers. Voice policies relates to the privileges that users have in your Lync environment. You don't want everyone to be able to dial international numbers. We can use voice policies in Lync and associate those policies to particular users to say who can dial particular types of numbers. Who can dial service numbers? Everyone normally. Who can dial premium rate numbers? Normally no one. Who can dial international numbers? Executives, higher management maybe. What about people who are just restricted to national numbers? Mobile numbers, internal calling only. We do all that through voice policies. So naturally, there's a large amount of planning there around who can do what. You need to be able to identify that at the beginning, so we don't roll out a Lync solution that will result in costs being incurred because of people dialing numbers that they shouldn't be. PBX integration and migration I talked about at the start of this slide with the image on the right. That's a very basic high-level overview of a phased migration. SBA and SBS considerations. Going back to the multiple site scenario, perhaps you've got a main site and you've got 100 users in that site, and you deploy Lync there, and you deploy Lync for voice, and everything's brilliant, you use Lync for everything. And you've got a branch office for your company, but it's only got 5 users in it. Do you really want to invest in the hardware, etc., to put in that office so that they can do everything that people in the main office can? Probably not. But do you want to run the risk of them operating over the WAN connection, and when that WAN goes down, they can't make telephone calls or do anything else that's related to Lync because they're then cut off from the Lync servers at the main HQ? Probably not either. So you're in a bit of a sticky ground. So Microsoft and vendors have created these appliances called SBAs and SBS appliances. It stands for Survivable Branch Appliance and Survivable Branch Server. So an SBA, a Survivable Branch Appliance, on the diagram on the right, we've got the gateway or SBC that I introduced between your phone system and the PSTN, and we've got a Lync server off to the right of it. Well, an SBA takes those two things and it bundles them into one piece of hardware. So it's a gateway solution that has Lync elements on it. Now, it doesn't have all the Lync elements. It only has the Lync registrar service, which enables people to sign in, and it only has the Lync mediation service, which enables calls to be transcoded before they go out to the PSTN. So what that gives you is, regardless of if your WAN goes down and people can't get back to the main servers, it means that people can still sign in against that appliance because it's a registrar service, and then they can still call out to the PSTN because it's also a mediation server. But for things like conferences, response groups, monitoring and archiving, all the things that are typically located with the front end, it doesn't have those. It's basically the means to allow users to still sign in and still make a telephone call. And at the end of the day, typically, that's the most critical functionality in a fully fledged Lync deployment, the ability for people to make phone calls. We're in a place in the world now, thanks to the history of telephony, where you never pick up a phone and not hear a dial tone. You always hear a dial tone. So that's what we strive to try and gain. Well, that's the what we measure ourselves by with Lync as well. And the SBA and the SBS solutions will do that for you. The SBS solution, incidentally, is not very common. I mentioned the SBA bundles the gateway and the Lync server together. But if you already had a gateway in your branch office because of some legacy requirement on your old phone system, and you're now using that for Lync, well, the SBS doesn't include the gateway component. So the SBA is minimal Lync services and gateway bundled together. The SBS is just the minimal Lync services. Okay, so you might use that if you already have a gateway or a piece of hardware you can use there. But just know that SBA can provide you with telephony resilience in your branch offices. Voice device consideration. There's a slide in a moment about the Lync ecosystem and the number of vendors involved and how many appliances are on the market. It's up to the user community and the people that manage them to decide whether or not things like personal conferencing devices or headsets are chosen over things like traditional desk phones, etc. It's a tricky one because people tend to invest heavily in desk phones with Lync, And then as people become more and more familiar with using a software-based phone system, they think, I'll just use a headset. So they use a headset rather than a desk phone, but then as a company, you've already invested heavily in handsets and devices. So it's a good idea to get things like model offices going, or to get some trial devices in, so that the user community can kind of get a grip and put their feelers out regarding those. We've got a model office going on a couple of the Lync deployments that we're doing at the moment. They've done a phased migration. They've deployed Lync as IM and Presence. It's gone down very well for the company. They've got 800 users. It's gone down very well. Everyone there is really happy using Lync with IM and Presence. And they're now looking, as their current ISDN contract is coming to an end, they're looking at moving over to a SIP trunk service and also deploying enterprise voice. So because they've already got a Lync environment, we've loaned them, I think, 11 or 12 test devices, which they've got out now, and they're just putting on their environment and testing accordingly. Because there's so much out there from a design, deployment and planning point of view, it's a good idea to get key stakeholders to shortlist particular devices. So shortlist 5 headsets, shortlist 5 desk phones, shortlist 5 personal conferencing devices. And typically the choices that key stakeholders and IT personnel make are quite savvy in the beginning anyway. And then you just expose the user community to the shortlist that you've compiled, and they choose from that, which is much better than kind of exposing them to 90 different headsets and then asking them to choose that, which would just be a degree of chaos. The final point there is SIP trunking services. Not everyone knows what a SIP trunk is, so I'll tell you. But traditionally, telephone systems are connected to the PSTN through ISDN, otherwise referred to as sometimes PRI or BRI, Premium Rate Interface, Basic Rate Interface. But nowadays, because the world is becoming so well connected, a lot of people have really fast data connections from wherever they're working to their SIP trunk provider in the outside world. They're really fast and they're really big as well. So it makes sense that we can move things onto the IP network and start using IP for other services that we couldn't do before. And because we're in this well-connected world now, it means we can look at using the IP network for traditional phone systems. So rather than have these bundles of copper wire that come into your premises at the moment, you might choose to have all that functionality go over a SIP trunk, which is an IP connection to a provider. Now, typically, SIP trunks they cost less money. So if you haven't got a SIP trunk at the moment and you're really well connected and your ISDN contract is coming towards completion, then SIP trunking is definitely something that you should look into because it's cheaper. Well, it's cheaper because as a provider, they don't have to worry about the management of cables coming into your environment. They don't have to worry about hardware along the line. They don't have to worry about degradation, maintenance costs, etc. They don't need to employ as many people to maintain a SIP trunk service against ISDN service. So those costs are typically, not all of them obviously, but those costs are typically passed on to the end users, me and you, that subscribe to SIP trunking services. SIP trunks are a lot more flexible as well. So at the moment, some of you might have ISDN 30, some of you might have ISDN 2 or BRI. So if I only wanted 2 phone channels coming in, I'd get BRI, that's 2 channels. If I wanted 4, I'd get 2 sets of BRI. If I wanted 6, I'd get 3 sets of BRI. But if I wanted 8, I then have to bin all my BRI and get PRI, because the most you can have on BRI is 6 channels. So I've lost some cost or some investment there. Now I'm having to take out a new contract and I'm going for an ISDN 30 connection with 10 channels on. So there's a lot of work around changing the number of channels that you subscribe to on ISDN. The turnaround process is very slow. And in contrast, a SIP trunking service is comparatively infinitely more flexible. You can have a SIP trunk service with 1 channel. And if you wanted 8 channels, you just phone them and say, can I have 8 channels? And they say yes. And they probably tick a box somewhere on a software-based platform. In terms of turnaround times, they're very, very, very quick. So that escalation or scaling down, if preferred, of channels and availability can be done in a 24-hour basis. Once again, it depends strongly on who you go with is your SIP trunk provider. Some people will say that they can turn around any request inside 24 hours. But ultimately, a SIP trunking service, if compared against an ISDN service of the same functionality, will always come in cheaper, and it will be far more flexible. The other big bonus to SIP trunking services is disaster recovery. If I had two sites, Site A and Site B, and I've got a SIP trunk service from, I don't know, Virgin Media or Pure IP, they might be sending all my calls to Site A. They're doing it because they know the public IP that I want to receive those calls on. They just throw every call at that public IP. Now, if all of a sudden Site A burned down and we all jump over to Site B, the disaster recovery scenario for a SIP trunk is we simply give them a new public IP to fire their calls at. And then that's it. It's as simple as that. All calls will then go to Site B. Traditionally, with an ISDN service, you've probably got something in place that wouldn't even have been tested because the effort and administration overhead in testing things like ISDN failover at the provider level isn't free for sure. It's quite time consuming. But with the SIP trunking service, you can even test that out of hours. They'll happily do that for you, and then they'll flip it back to the public IP that's on the primary site. If your IPs are also managed by someone who's involved in your DR process, then it's also quite feasible that they will stand up the same public IP in your DR site, so the public IP will just jump over to the new site, in which case there's no changeover requirement for the SIP trunking provider either, because the IP stays the same, calls just end up where they're meant to anyway, because they're none the wiser. All they're interested in is the public IP. So by all means, it's definitely worth something investigating, and it's something that comes to the forefront. And there's a question we always ask when people say, yeah, we're now moving over to voice, and we say, okay, you're using SIP trunk or ISDN? And if they say, oh, what's a SIP trunk? Then we kind of have that conversation, and there's a cost saving to be had there. High availability and disaster recovery. I mentioned it earlier on, and it says it here as well, that we do HA via pooling for link roles. So that's front-end servers, edge servers, etc. If you want HA, plonk some more servers in the pool, and it gives you a degree of high resilience. Something to be aware of is capacity planning. I mentioned that a standard edition server will typically take around 5,000 users. So if you had 10,000 users, you might deploy 2 Enterprise Edition front-end servers and say each of those can hold around 6,000 users. That's 12,000 in total. That will accommodate our 10,000 users, 2 servers. But the idea of HA is to accommodate your environment in the event of an outage. So if one of those servers was to fail, that's 6,000 users without a home. And they can't go on to the other server because that's already got 6,000 users on. So what I'm trying to say is, although you can accommodate users on servers initially based on capacity planning considerations and the calculator, you need to look forward and decide what's going to happen when one of those servers fails. Is there enough space on the other servers to house all the users that have just failed? Probably not if you're doing it purely on accommodation on all servers being up in the initial planning, if you like. So be aware of that. Lync pool pair offerings. Pool pairing was something that was introduced with Lync 2013. It enables you to pair 2 front-end servers or pools. So if I had 2 standard edition servers, I can pool pair them, and they will replicate data between each other. Then if a server fails, I can simply move everyone over to the other standard edition server. Same with enterprise pools. If I had 2 enterprise pools, one in New York, one in England, and the New York one failed, I could fail everyone there over to the England pool if they're pool paired between those 2 pools. Okay, it's a new technology. It replicates data between the 2. All user information is maintained on both pools. So it means when a user has failed over, they still have all their contacts and the ability to do everything on the new pool. I mentioned the acceptance to persistent chat, and when people talk to you about persistent chat high availability, you just need to be aware that the process isn't the same. It's not simply a case of dropping more servers in a pool, and that the persistent chat will use a stretched pool topology instead for disaster recovery. Metropolitan site resilience. Previously, in other versions of Lync and on other unified communications platforms, metropolitan site resilience, what's meant by that is if I had 2 offices and I put 2 front-end servers in a pool, I might put one of those servers in one office and one in the other and tell myself, well, at least if one office burns down, the other office is okay, and that's where the other server is. You can't do that in Lync. You can't stretch a front-end pool. So if I've got 10,000 users in Manchester and I put 2 Enterprise Edition front-end servers there to accommodate all those users, I can't take one of them and put it down in London. Okay, we can't stretch the pool like that. So that's what's meant by metropolitan site resilience, not supported in Lync 2013. Some people, some consultants and some people who push out Lync topologies and solutions for clients, they will try to stretch your pool for you, but it's completely unsupported. And if you have a problem with a stretch pool or metropolitan site topology, you won't get any support from Microsoft, so just be aware of that. PSTN resilience is no different to how PSTN exists now, really. The gateway and the SBC that I talked about that we'd introduce for Lync, you can pair those up in an HA scenario and they can pass calls between each other. Lync will know if one of those goes down because it will send keep alive requests to those gateways. As soon as the gateway goes down, it won't pass calls to that particular gateway anymore, it will only use the other one. So that is simply a case of doubling up the hardware if PSTN resilience is a requirement for you from a Lync perspective. And then the same with branch sites as well. We talked about the SPAs that we deploy in the branch site. You don't have to do that. If you've got a rock solid WAN infrastructure and your WAN hasn't dropped in 10 years and that's got its own resiliency built in, and you're happy for branch users in an office that consists of only perhaps 15 users to pass their calls over the WAN and break out the main office, that's fine. But like I said, if you want some disaster recovery there or some availability in the event the WAN goes down, then something like an SBA or a survivable branch appliance will cater to that for you. Lync client devices for Lync. There are many. The Lync attendant console is something that you might read about, and some people still push it. The Lync attendant console is geared around, it's also referred to as an operator console, it's geared around receptionists and people that handle more than one call at a time. It looks slightly different to the Lync client because it has larger windows that allow you to see incoming calls, current calls, and pending calls that you've got on hold, etc. And like I said, geared around receptionists and people who take a slightly higher call volume than normal people. It was released in 2010, Lync Attendant 2010, and it wasn't revised or re-released in any other flavor for 2013. So it wasn't redone. It receives very little in terms of updates. It doesn't get much love from Microsoft. And third-party vendors now have started creating their own attendant consoles and selling those on as third-party solutions, which do a much better job than the attendant console. So just be aware of that as you go and read about things with Lync. The 2010 and 2013 client for Windows, that's the desktop flavor software. Incidentally, the 2010 client will work fine on a 2013 environment and vice versa as well. Lync client for Mac is getting a lot more love lately. There was a time when the Mac client was slightly behind the Windows client in terms of feature set, but a lot of effort has gone on in the latter part of this year to bring things up to speed, and my experience of the Mac client, it works very well now. The App Store on Windows 8, for example, there's a Lync client available on the Windows App Store. That shouldn't say Lync App Store, it should say Windows App Store. So that's available in there. And the mobile clients I mentioned are available on major mobile platforms, which are Android, Windows, and iPhone, but not available on BlackBerry. Android embedded phone is a new feature that we've just seen. It's someone pushing the boundaries where they've taken the client that's available for Android mobile phones and they've actually put that into a desk phone. So it's almost like desk phone running the mobile client. It looks very weird, but it's a great product and it's got a touch screen and everything. It's Android-based desk phone basically, and you'll see more and more of those come to the market now. There are perhaps only 2 or 3 available at the moment, all from the same vendor. I think it's the GX7300 if you wanted to Google it, but they're very, very good phones, and I think we're going to see more people adopt the Android embedded phones as time goes on. Lync Phone Edition devices are phones made by Polycom, Astra, and HP that have a slimmed down Lync client running in the actual phone. It's called Lync Phone Edition. They're very good. They have a great feature set. They tether to desktop clients to give you better together functionality. So when you click call on your desktop client on your screen, your phone knows you're doing that, and you can pick up the handset and you'll be on the call. Whereas traditionally, without this better together experience, you'd click call on your desktop client and your phone wouldn't know you're doing that because there's no connection to the phone. So that's what the better togetherness experience is that you might read about as you're looking into devices. It means you've got click to call on your desktop and your phone knows what you're doing at all times. So the Lync Phone Edition devices, they came out when Lync came out. Once again, they're still running really Lync Phone Edition 2010. And when Lync 2013 came along, they just dropped the 2010 and it wasn't suffixed with 2013. So no further development has really gone on with the firmware for those. We still get bug fixes for the firmware across those three devices, the HP, the Polycom and the Astra. But it's been announced by Microsoft now that they're going to stop support in 2018 for these devices. So you can still buy them, they're still great, and if your tech refresh is going to be well in advance of 2018, then it's not a problem for you. But if we get to sort of 2015, 2016, you might want to consider whether or not you want to invest in Lync Phone Edition devices, given that support is going to end 2 years later in 2018. Okay. Now with that announcement, all the third-party vendors stood up and thought brilliant, because Microsoft have basically opened up the desk phone requirement arena, if you like, to third-party vendors. Third-party vendors can now create their own firmware. They can qualify that with Lync through the Microsoft accreditation programs, and then they can get badged as optimized or certified for Lync desk phones. And so we're seeing more and more and more third-party desk phone solutions now. Now, it used to be that Lync Phone Edition devices were called optimized for Lync because they offered the best optimized experience and integration with the Lync client, the desktop client. But as time goes on now, the third-party vendors are really pushing the boundaries and introducing a lot more functionality and a richer feature set into their phones. Polycom, for example, the VVX series of phones that they do have an amazing set of the feature set is very, very large, a lot of which you'd turn off because it's almost become bloatware. There's that much you can do on those phones. As another example, the better togetherness experience for the Lync phones do, where you need the USB lead. Well, the third-party vendors have gone one step further, and they're utilizing that functionality, and they've come out with a way of actually achieving that over IP. So that's done over the network connection now that the phone already has, and it can be paired with the desktop client. So that's BTOE over Ethernet. So it's a good thing because with so many vendors in the market, the cost of these devices is being driven down because they all want us to buy their phones. But in the same vein, the feature sets and them trying to set themselves apart from their other vendors is pushing the product into better places. So we're in a good place regarding third-party phones at the moment. And the final point, the linkstore.co.uk, I see Chris has already posted that in the chat window there. That's actually run by Nexus. That's one of our sites. But we kind of more use that to just make sure that people are aware of the products that are out there. We don't make any margin off of Lync Store. We purely use it to expose people to endpoint devices, and that if you have any questions around Lync or deployment or topology or planning or troubleshooting or anything to do with your Lync platform at all, you're just aware that the people behind that store have got a rather large amount of experience when it comes to deploying Lync. So by all means, if you've already got a Lync environment and you're looking to buy handsets, they're probably the same price on that store. They're just all consolidated in a easy to view GUI, if you like. And then on the right there are some of the vendors: Snom, Polycom, Astra, Audio Codes, Jabra. Headsets I haven't even touched on this slide, but there are an infinite amount of headsets out there that are qualified for Lync. And even devices that aren't qualified for Lync, if they get good reviews, and you wanted to get a trial of one of those devices, then by all means do so and see how you get on with it. Just because a device isn't qualified or certified for Lync, if it's £40 to buy, then it's not a showstopper. There used to be a time in 2010 where we would be religious about certification and qualification of anything going on the Lync environment. But, I mean, if you see a headset that's absolutely brilliant and everyone loves it, and it's £25 a pop, and you've got 100 users, and it's going to save you thousands and thousands of pounds, pilot that, test it, read how other people are getting on with that product in their Lync environment. It does mean you're not going to have any support from Microsoft if you had call quality issues with that particular headset. but then that's why you should pilot it and test it accordingly in the first instance. At the end of the day, as much as we like qualified and optimized devices, they are only qualified because somebody has paid Microsoft to go through their certification program, and it is a revenue earner for Microsoft. So, but we're a Microsoft house, but I'd quite happily say that just because of the ecosystem that's out there. Contact center solutions doesn't affect everyone. A contact center is a group of people that take a high volume of calls for dedicated purposes. So if you're a theatre and you had a box office number, chances are when someone calls that main box office number, it ends up in a room that's full of 15, 20, 50, 100 people all answering calls and selling tickets. That's a contact center. Lync can do contact center behavior in very limited functionality. It can do the call flow. So it can pass a single number and it can pass it to a hunt group that consists of lots of people. You can decide how you'd like that call to enter those people, whether it should go to the one that's been idle the longest, or whether it should round robin them all, or whether it should just pick randomly, or whether it should ring them all and then the first one to pick up the phone gets it. Lync can do all that. Where it falls short in terms of a contact center solution is those features that are unique to industry contact centers. So the ability for someone who answers a call to then say, oh, I'm struggling, I need to get my manager in on this call, to themselves, and then to quietly bring the manager in on that call, while all the time the caller, the person that called in, is unaware of this third party entering the call. Silent whisper, for example, I think the feature is called in the contact center world. That type of functionality is a contact center solution feature. That's not done in Lync. In the same vein, if someone wants to turn around and say, okay, I'm not happy with, we've received lots of complaints, how long are people waiting in these queues before we answer their calls? And then you can pull out the metrics and your contact center solution will tell you the average caller waits 39 seconds before they get through to an operator. That doesn't happen in Lync. And in the same vein, the wallboard functionality that's on the slide there that tells you what agents are in the call, what agent is busy, etc. That's not a feature of Lync. But it's not, those things aren't meant to be, because Lync isn't a contact center solution. If we were to chase that and start introducing features that did that, then there are about 6-7 other fronts that we'd be fighting on as well, trying to extend the features on to bleed into areas that Lync isn't meant to be, which is like a contact center solution. So we lean on the Lync ecosystem. There are already major vendors out there who make the biggest contact centers and most popular contact centers in the world, like House and Mitel, and they have qualified their products for use on Lync. And you deploy them as you would a normal contact center solution for House or Mitel, for example, and then we can configure those to integrate natively into a Lync environment so that people use Lync as their telephony solution still. They still use the Lync soft client, they still use the Lync qualified devices, but they get a contact center solution that's exactly the same as it would be if it was deployed outside a Lync environment. It just ties in nicely to your Lync infrastructure. And it says there, Lync is not designed to be an all-encompassing contact center solution. It's not. If you've got 5 or 6 people that take calls for a single number, Lync might do that for you. And if you're willing to forgo the reporting services and the advanced features, then perhaps you don't need a contact center solution. But for these places that have fully fledged 100 user environments, all selling tickets or all taking ICT tech calls, for example, and you need like a wrap-up time where you finish on the call and then you click I'm done, and it pops up a window and you write notes about the call you just had, and then you click wrap up done and it takes you back to being an active agent. Those types of things, if you were to look into the contact center world, they're industry standards and they're expected features of a contact center solution. So that's not what Lync is. If you have a contact center requirement, be very aware that there are many out there that are qualified for Lync. Okay, and this is a good slide actually to follow on from that. If you were to jump on Google and put in Lync certified applications or Lync interoperability program, you'll end up at a web page that has these 2 big blue squares on it. I think it's Lync interoperability qualification. And on here you can access these and they will take you further into products that are qualified for Lync. So the contact center solution we were just looking at there, if I was to click on apps, it would take me to a software page perhaps, and I could look at things like call recording, call monitoring, wallboard services, contact center solutions. And within those, we'll see all the qualified software solutions in each of those fields that we can integrate with Lync while still leveraging all the Lync functionality. And you'll find things like the Mitel and the Enghouse contact center solutions in there. And the bullet points there just show a number of other things that you'll find within the certification program that have been qualified against Lync criteria. So all the IP phones and the headsets, the audio devices, etc., they've been thoroughly tested in conferences, peer-to-peer calls, etc. Lync room systems we already touched on, and other conferencing devices. Security and encryption, we talked about at the beginning about the DDoS attack and someone signing in constantly over and over and over again, getting it wrong and then locking out my AD account. Well, security and encryption software will prevent that. So the Lync ecosystem is absolutely huge, and it's really healthy and really good, and it's so vibrant. The interesting thing is a lot of the people that develop these products and the hardware as well actually have their own bespoke PBX solution, like Astra, for example, who make the Lync Phone Edition devices and a number of other phones. They actually have their own PBX as well. So it's testament to the progress of Lync and how well respected and how forward driving it is that other vendors, although they have their own phone solutions, are making devices for Lync as well. So that's quite good to know. Okay, I appreciate that's quite whirlwind, guys. I'd never really paused for breath, and I can understand if you walk out of there thinking, crikey. I can make this available for download. I guess we have all the email addresses of everyone in this conference. Yeah, Chris is nodding at me. So I can provide this to you as well. So by all means, ping an email through or respond to the one that sent you this invite, and we can get you this slide deck, etc. But it is very high level. There's so much involved. I could quite easily talk about external access for a day. That wouldn't be a problem. If you do have, because of the high level at which it was pitched, if you do have further interest in a particular aspect of Lync, and you've been looking into planning and deployment, but you're not quite sure how it fit your own scenarios and situations, then by all means contact us again, and we can either let you know of something that's going to be a bit more tailored, like a complete external access overview, or we can even do one-to-one bespoke session that's not out of the picture. Ultimately, like I said, I'm a bit of an evangelist, so the more I get Lync out there, the more engagement we get. I don't mind doing whatever it takes to get that done. Be aware, in 2015, it's going to be Skype for Business, and at that point, I think we'll see a massive uptake after that rebranding exercise. People are a lot more aware of that. Yeah, that's a good point as well, Roy. Let me just dig that up for you now. In fact, what we'll do, guys, if people want the link to the capacity planning calculator,
there'll be a follow-up email going out, so we can include that as part of the follow-up email.
Okay, cool. Is that okay, Roy? What we'll do is I'll make sure that's on the follow-up email that goes out. I'll include some other links that are regularly used on planning and deployment exercises. So capacity planning calculator. There's a few matrices as well that are available regarding what some devices have, desk phones, etc., compared to other devices. But it's quite a huge exercise. It's very massive, so I do apologise that it's so high level. But to get everything done in what was meant to be an hour has actually transpired to be nearly 2. I do appreciate everyone sort of being patient. And in the same vein, if you've got any questions, then just ping them through, and we can answer those in emails as well.